This is the first of a series of discussions I'll be having related to the Road to Roota Disclosure Project. And the first PowerPoint presentation is called Discovering the Road to Roota, the Federal Reserve Bank's secret plot to destroy fiat money and return the United States to a gold standard. First, a little about myself. My name is Weir. I have 30 years experience in the financial industry with various Fortune 500 companies. I'm the creator of the Road to Roota theory, with commentary published at roadtoroota.com. I've spent the last 15 years exposing the long-term manipulation of the gold and silver markets. Work closely with the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, otherwise known as GATA. Roadtoroota.com deals with the conspiracy and manipulation side of the gold, silver, and financial markets. We are not constrained by the conventional thinking of how market prices fluctuate. The information presented here is meant to aid in the discovery of the truth behind our massively manipulated markets and to help expose those who threaten our free market system. Part one of this presentation is the Federal Reserve Bank comic book called Wishes and Rainbows. It was January 2007 when I first discovered the information released by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. It changed my understanding of the gold and silver markets, the financial markets, the energy markets, the monetary system, as well as the true essence of my country, the United States of America. Interestingly enough, it came in the form of a children's comic book written by the Federal Reserve Bank. And there it is, Wishes and Rainbows. First of all, what is the Road to Roota theory? Road to Roota theory postulates that there is a group of people in the United States as well as around the world that are working to remove and destroy the financial banking powers that have secretly controlled all aspects of our lives for hundreds of years. The original idea of this group sprang from the mind of Alan Greenspan and involved rigging markets with computer programs that he had invented in the 1960s. The process continues to this day. So why did the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston post a comic book on their website on January 1st, 2007 with two large red exclamation points after them? First of all, January 1st, 2007 is a holiday. I was at their website on December 31st, 2006. For some reason, this very site the next day posted these comic books with huge red exclamation points on them. That's exactly what it looks like. Since then, they have removed the red exclamation points, but the page is still there with the Wishes and Rainbows comic and the Road to Roota, which is the teacher's guide to the Wishes and Rainbows comic. They are still on the Fed Boston website. The website address is right there at the bottom of this page. Now, the original idea of this comic book came from a short story that was written in the Fed Boston monthly newsletter that was published in September of 1980, which was a short story called Wishes and Rainbows. I actually got this copy of the original short story from the Fed Boston a few years back. Later on, I asked again because I had lost it, and they said they didn't know what I was talking about and couldn't find it. So I might actually have the last copy of the original short story. So after the short story was published in 1980, the Fed turned it into a comic book. And in 1981, they released the comic for Wishes and Rainbows. Now, this comic is extremely difficult to find, so all you comic book collectors out there should be on the hunt for this original 1981 Wishes and Rainbows comic. The 2007 version, there's a lot of them out there, although they are out of print. The Fed does not print these anymore. They just have a PDF download you can get on that website. So those are the two different versions of this Wishes and Rainbow comic. Obviously, it's very important to the Fed for it to publish this in the first place and then come out in 2007 to publish it. I might note that in 1981, we were talking about going back onto a gold standard, and Reagan had set up the Gold Commission to study the meaning of going back to a gold standard. And in 2007, we're on the brink of the financial collapse. So really interesting times that these comics were released, and I'll get more into that in a second. This is the inside cover of both the versions, and they pretty much say the same thing. It was written by a woman named Deborah Carpenter Beck. I don't know much about her, and there's not much to find on her on the internet, at least. But the other guy, the guy who adapted it into a comic book, is a guy named Steven DuVal, and I found out quite a bit about him, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. So I'm going to go through a summary of Wishes and Rainbows. It's a very odd comic. It's very cryptic with a lot of hidden meaning. But I'll just run through quickly a summary of what this comic is saying. Wishes and Rainbows is a story of a little girl named Roota who lives in a world of no color and is told by her grandmother stories of a wonderful place with colored flowers called Colorland. Her grandmother warns Roota that the people who live in Colorland are very big and can step on the small people of Pebbleton. Roota says that she's not afraid of the big people of Colorland and will bring some colors back to her grandmother and the people of Pebbleton. Roota then searches all around and finally finds colored flowers through a cave in Cobblestone Canyon after seeing a beautiful golden light. Roota then tries to bring colored flowers to all the people of Pebbleton, but there's not enough to go around. To solve this problem, Roota plants the hard black tears of the flowers and shines the golden light on them to grow new colored flowers, but there are still not enough to go around. Like I said, this is a very odd comic. It's very cryptic, but there's hidden meaning here. The mayor of Pebbleton then tasks Roota with allocating the scarce colored flowers fairly to the people. Roota writes her plans in the sand and decides to allocate flowers to the people, starting from the oldest Pebble person down to the youngest. Now, even though the model seems to work for a while, Roota continues to look for more colored flowers in an attempt to ultimately return the people to Colorland forever. So what is the purpose of this cryptic Fed comic? Well, the Fed tells us the purpose in the teacher's guide that they released with the comic. This is directly from The Road to Roota, a teacher's guide. The name of the teacher's guide is The Road to Roota, and these are quotes right out of that book. Wishes and Rainbows is for elementary school children and may be read as a simple story or as an economic teaching tool. Wishes and Rainbows illustrates many economic concepts including scarcity, supply and demand, and allocation. All of them, that's economics right there. It's very interesting that they had to write it in a strange comic book, but it's not far from the realm of what the Fed deals with. But they wrote more. One critical function that scarce commodities have often served is as commodity money. The scarcity of an item is one quality that makes it suitable for use as money, since limitations on supply serve to enhance its value. In addition, rarity precludes a sudden influx of the commodity, which could trigger a decrease in the money's value and result in inflation. Some items that have been used as money because of their scarcity include gunpowder, tobacco, animal skins, and precious metals. There we have the Federal Reserve Bank talking about scarcity and talking about why commodity money is desired and ending it with, and they use precious metals. Interesting. That's all I have to say about that is the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the anti-commodity money place, is saying that it can play a critical function in the monetary system. But they say more. The mayor of Pebbleton announces that since the colored flowers are so rare and valuable, they are going to be used as money with petals for change. So anybody who argues that this isn't a monetary allegory, this comic, the Fed Teacher's Guide just shot that one down right away. And here finally they say, has this analysis of the social and economic implications of Wishes and Rainbows overstretched the metaphor? For anyone who may think so, we call attention to the market for tulips in the 17th century Holland. Remember the tulip mania, the bubble, and that big deal was supposedly the first monetary collapse. All this is stated in the Fed Teacher's Guide, that there's more going on in this comic than what meets the eye, and I'll show you even more stuff in just a second here. Now we're going to go through the comic page by page, and what I want you to think about is I'm going to give you some substitution words for this comic. The Fed has already told us that there's more going on here. So when you're reading through this comic, I want you to think about substituting these words. First, for the land of no color, think about the unbacked fiat monetary system. Colorland is equal to the gold standard. The black tears are representative of the petrodollar, or the oil standard. Pebbleton is the United States of America. The Pebble people are U.S. citizens. Cobblestone Canyon is actually the Grand Canyon, and we'll talk about the gold that's in the Grand Canyon in a few more slides. Gopher Junction is Mexico. I love that name, Gopher Junction, because of the illegal tunnels that smuggle people and drugs into the U.S. It's a perfect name. And then at the top is Boulders Ridge, Canada. Think of Mounties. Roota. The character Roota, the name is significant, but the person it represents is Alan Greenspan, and I'll get into why Greenspan in a second. The character Rocky in this cartoon is Steven DuVal, the guy who adapted the original comic book. The grandmother in the comic is ex-Fed Chairman Arthur Burns. The mayor is President Gerald Ford. Now that's the full list of the words that you're going to see in this comic that I want you to substitute the background meaning for. Now I'm going to walk you through the entire comic. Now remember, this is coming from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. It's a comic book that's meant for kids. And that's what the 2007 version, that's the cover of it. What I'll do is I'll read this, comment here and there, but then we'll go into a full analysis afterwards. And it starts off. Deep beneath the ground, between Boulders Ridge and Gophers Junction, lies the little town of Pebbleton. The town looks like any other, except for one thing. There is no color. Because of the lack of color, all the houses look alike, and every street seems like any other street. The little Pebble people look the same, each about 6 inches tall, and instead of pretty pink blouses, blue pants, or yellow scarves, they wear only whites, blacks, and grays. And there you have a woman reading to little kids a children's story. The parents saying, "Look at the pretty shades of gray in the rainbow." People getting into traffic fights because there's no difference between dark gray and light gray. The only thing I'd point out in this picture is that look at the story they're reading, The Little Gray Riding Hood. One of the most terrifying children's stories ever invented was Little Red Riding Hood, as we all know what happens at the end of that one. The next page, the Pebble people are not happy in their world of no color. For centuries they have heard of stories of a legendary Colorland, and they long to look upon the blues, reds, and yellows they have heard so much about. And then the grandmother is reading, and then Jack saw the goose flap its wings and lay its magnificent golden egg. And Roota says, "What does golden mean, Grandma?" And Grandma says, "Oh, Roota, golden is one of the beautiful colors of Colorland, along with blue and red and purple and oh, so many others. All my life I have dreamed of seeing the things that the stories describe, a tree's autumn colors or a flower's softly tinted petals." And Roota says, "But if Colorland is so beautiful, Grandma, why doesn't anyone ever go there?" All I'd like to point out on this page is look at the word golden. It is underlined. It is put in bold and in parentheses. Very, very kind of pointing it out. Hey, this is something you should look at, and it's talked about all throughout that comic. And remember, this is the Federal Reserve Bank talking about gold. So we move on to the next page. This is probably maybe the second most important page in this comic book. So Roota had asked her grandmother, why don't we go to Colorland? If it's so wonderful, why doesn't anybody go there? And here's what Grandma says. Because the people who live in Colorland are very big and might accidentally step on any pebble person who visits. All our people are afraid to go there. And besides, nobody knows how to reach Colorland. Some say you can get there through the caves near Cobblestone Canyon. Now let's just take a moment to think about what the Fed just said right there. They're writing comic books for little kids, but they're talking about these big people who step on these little people. And they if you notice, the word big is just blown up, and then step on is underlined, and all our people are afraid to go there. Well, who's the Fed afraid of? Very interesting. This is where it got really cryptic and kind of sideways when I first read it. So remember this passage, because we'll get back to it. Roota goes on to say, I'm not afraid, Grandma. I often play in those caves, and someday I will find the way to Colorland and bring back some of those colors. So Roota and her friend Rocky go off to play. One day, a few weeks later, Roota and her friend Rocky are playing hide and seek in the caves. 1001, 1002. As she runs through one tunnel, Roota sees a large boulder on a ledge above her. If I could push that boulder aside and hide beneath it, Rocky would never find me. Notice the never is underlined. There's a reason for that. Why is Roota hiding? Suddenly, the boulder rolls aside, rumble, rumble, and a dazzling ray of golden sunlight shines on Roota. At first, Roota has to cover her eyes to protect them from the light, but at last she grows accustomed to it, and she climbs through the hole and looks out. Voila! There you have the colors of Colorland. Notice the golden light that shines on Roota. And remember, this is the Federal Reserve. They're afraid to even talk about gold. Let's move on. Roota leaps to her feet and runs among the flowers. Oh, I found them. I found the colors Grandma told me about. Oh, they are more magnificent than I had ever imagined. This is the most beautiful of them all. If only Grandma and the other pebble people could see it. Then Roota has an idea. Carrying the flowers, she returns through the hole and turns for one last look. Goodbye, beautiful colors. I will see you again someday. Roota makes her way back through the tunnels and finds Rocky. She tells him of her adventure. So this is what color looks like. It is prettier than ever imagined. I can hardly wait to show Grandma. Quickly, they take the flower back to Pebbleton and show it to Roota's grandmother. Oh, Roota, it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. You made me very happy. And so Roota is happy for impressing his grandmother, or Greenspan is happy for impressing his mentor, Arthur Burns. We'll get into that in a second. Anyway, everybody's happy to find these colors. But what should we do with it, Grandma? The people of Pebbleton have been without color for so long. Why don't you and Rocky plant it in the town square? The children follow Grandma's suggestion, and now all the Pebble people will know how pretty color is. And they're all standing around admiring the colored flower. It makes the whole town seem brighter and happier. Perhaps Roota would go back for more. How I would love to have a flower of my very own. The most beautiful thing I ever saw. How did we ever survive without the pretty colors? Is that petal blue or purple? And here's a little hint down here in the bottom. I don't know, but I think the stem is green, as in monetary green, as in the greenback. Anyway, wouldn't it be wonderful if every citizen of Pebbleton could have a flower? Roota and Rocky are summoned before the mayor. And so as mayor, I instruct you to go back to Colorland and bring back more flowers. Happily, Roota and Rocky return to the caves, but a rock slide has closed off that whole tunnel. What do we do now? Now notice that word is rock slide is put in bold. Very important for later. Don't be so sad. We still have one colored flower. But everybody in Pebbleton wants one. They will never be happy unless we find more. We must search for another opening to Colorland. After a long search, look, Rocky, there's a golden light ahead. Again, the gold. Hooray, another entrance to Colorland. But their joy soon fades. Look, Roota, the golden light is coming from that little hole in the ceiling. It's so high, even the tallest ladder in Pebbleton could never come close to reaching it. We have searched through all the caves, and there is no other entrance to Colorland. And they're sitting there all sad. Cheer up, the people of Pebbleton will have to learn to share the colors of our only flower. But so many people and only one flower. They return to Pebbleton. Oh, look, Roota! The bright and pretty flower has become wilted and gray. And look at the ground underneath the flower. Roota's all sad. And then the flower sheds 3 hard black tears. The flower's color cannot live without the golden light of the world above, but it is said that its tears will grow new flowers if they receive the light. Is this getting cryptic and bizarre enough for you? Does that black spot on the ground look a little like oil to you? Anyway, moving on. This gives Roota an idea. Come on, Rocky, let's go back to the cave. Once there, she places the 3 tears under the earth where the golden light shines down. The children take turns watering the spot every day. After a few days, 3 green shoots poke through the ground. Soon, voila, you got new flowers. I think these green shoots are different than Obama's green shoots lately. Anyway, bursting with happiness, the children race back to Pebbleton with the good news. But as mayor, I certainly should receive one. I want one of the flowers. I was here first, so I should get one. I am the richest person in town, so I should get one. Basically, people are standing around arguing who's going to get this limited amount of flowers. If I don't get mine, I'll hold my breath till I get one. I'm the poorest, so I should be given one. Maybe that guy's a Bernie Sanders follower. Anyway, moving on. So the mayor says to Roota, you found the colors, so it is for you to decide who will get them. So it looks like Roota goes back to her grandma, and grandma says, the people of Pebbleton have been without color all their lives. Now they have seen its beauty and want more and more. Only you can decide who will get a flower and who won't. And Roota says, but what am I to do, Grandma? I have only 3 flowers, yet everybody wants one. So Roota returns to the sunlit cave. She sits beside the flowers, thinking. She writes numbers in the dust at her feet and then erases them. She draws pictures and erases those too. Look at this slide very carefully. We'll get back to it. At last, she returns to Pebbleton and summons everyone into the town square. I have listed everyone from the oldest Pebble person to the youngest Pebble baby. Roota calls the first 3 names and hands each a flower. When those 3 flowers lose their colors, we will use their tears to plant more. In time, everyone will be given a flower. And then you see another picture of Pebbleton with a bunch of new flowers planted all over, but still a lot of gray. Years have passed. A rock slide has opened another hole in the ceiling and created another sunlit cave. Now the Pebble people can grow twice as many flowers as before, and the streets of Pebbleton are lined with beautiful colored flowers. And then we have the final page. But the townspeople are still not content. Many want 2, 3, and even 4 flowers of their own. Since Roota cannot grow that many in only 2 sunlit caves, she and Rocky still search for another opening to Colorland. So don't be surprised if some summer day when you're lying on the green grass and looking at the blue sky, you hear voices coming from underground. It could be Rocky and Roota searching for the entrance to Colorland. The end. And that's the final page, and you can see at the bottom of the back, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. All right, so I ran through the entire comic. I interjected a couple comments, but this is the full analysis of what's really going on in this comic. And truthfully, you have to read it 10 times to get to where I have gotten. But I'm going to walk you through how I got there so that you know that I'm not just making this stuff up. I'm going to link up all this important information so you can understand exactly what the Fed is trying to say here. Let's start with the name Roota. Where did the name Roota come from? I had no idea. I had never heard of it before. I did a lot of internet searches just because it was such an odd name. Finally found some information going back into the 1970s computer manuals. Very interesting. In computer programming languages, root refers to the top level directory of a file system. The word is derived from a tree root since it represents the starting point of a hierarchical tree structure. Root A in financial computing would be the very first top level directory. And here's kind of a graphic that I found in an old IBM manual from the 70s on how to program computers. This was one of the first banking programs. Now I'm going to put together the Roota Greenspan connection and show you why it's my contention that Roota is representative of Alan Greenspan. The term Root A was developed in the first shareable computer programming language called BASIC, which was invented by John Kemeny. John Kemeny was a childhood friend of Alan Greenspan's in the early 1960s. In the 1960s, Alan Greenspan wrote the very first financial computer programs that developed into our current electronic monetary system. Most people have no idea that Greenspan was a computer geek in the 60s and had been programming his entire life. On page 204 of his book, The Age of Turbulence, Greenspan blames himself for the Y2K problem because he used only 2 digits to represent the year instead of 4 digits in his original monetary programs. Famed economist Pierre-Andre Reinfret said of Greenspan's company in the 1960s, they specialize in what is known as econometric model system of forecasting, which is forecasting by mathematical equations or modeling. I have a mental image of Alan at forums poring over his computer runs to evaluate whatever someone said and flipping the pages looking up numbers. I also remember him droning on reading the numbers off the spreadsheets. Greenspan was an Ayn Rand devotee and staunch gold bug, arguing for the return of a gold standard with a seminal paper, Gold and Economic Freedom, published in 1966. So you have Greenspan, who was knee-deep in computers, a gigantic gold bug from the 1960s, and he absolutely wanted to go back to a gold standard back in the 60s and even the 70s. And Alan Greenspan's mentor, the guy who he followed, like a puppy dog, was Fed Chairman Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns wanted to return to a gold standard as well in his early career, only to flip-flop in the 70s, helping drive inflation through the roof. And everybody was like, what is going on with Arthur Burns? He's printing money like it's going out of style. This is more of the plan that these guys concocted. So that's kind of where I started getting the idea that it might be Greenspan and the relationship between the grandmother, Roota's grandmother, and Roota. It fit that Greenspan-Burns relationship to a T. So I get a lot of questions on why was Greenspan really a computer geek? And to be a computer geek in the 1960s, you're amongst a handful of people who even know what a computer is. You got to remember this stuff. First of all, having started programming in the early 1960s, Alan Greenspan was decades ahead of any programmer trying to game the financial markets in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. He had decades of experience of how to rig the markets. He created the financial markets. And the big question to me was, why would Greenspan ever stop programming, given that computer programs are the most powerful tool in modern day economics? He never stopped programming. He can program continually throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. He programs today. Computer programmers don't just stop when their little method is working. They keep it going. Now, through his mentor Arthur Burns at the Fed, Greenspan had full access to the fastest computers in the world all the way back into the 1960s. It is rumored that the U.S. government has computers many times faster than the faster computers we think we have today. And they've had them since the 60s and 70s. They're like leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else as far as computer power, but they don't want to give out that secret because they use it to their advantage. As head of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Ford, Greenspan had the authority to rig any market he wanted via computer trading programs. The authority to rig markets comes from the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, which authorized the participation in any market. And the U.S. Treasury runs it out of the U.S. Fed using the Exchange Stabilization Fund money. That can be proven very easily, but that is where Greenspan got the power and authority to implement his computer trading models. And computer trading programs gave him the power to prolong and extend the unbacked fiat system for as long as they wanted by controlling the prices of all market-traded financial instruments, including gold, silver, oil, and the U.S. dollar. Now remember, the only reason that the unbacked fiat currency has lasted as long as it has, which is since we went off the gold standard in 1971, is because the prices of commodities have been kept in check. And the only way they were kept in check is through the computer trading programs invented by Greenspan and implemented by Greenspan. So my belief is a decision was made in the 1960s to run the unbacked fiat system to infinity, sucking up all the benefits of fiat money before imploding the entire electronic debt bubble. And there's proof of that in this comic that I will show you. But back to Greenspan, and this is kind of my final proof, and I found this in the archives, that Greenspan was knee-deep in the computer world and railing against the government. This is a 1984 commercial of Greenspan trying to sell the Apple IIc computers.
The Apple IIc and money.
People in high places are always asking me, Alan, where does the money go? If you wonder the same thing, I suggest an Apple IIc, an Apple modem. Then you can call up your bank and see how much money you have. You can even pay off your bills automatically. If you have any money left over, congratulations. You're doing better than the government is.
The Apple IIc. There's no telling how far it can take you.
Don't you just love that? And think, when Greenspan did that commercial, he had over 20 years of computer programming experience. How many other people were there still, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, who were expert computer programmers? Handful. That's it. There wasn't a lot. Not like today. Okay, moving on from Greenspan, who is this guy, Steven DuVal, the adapter of the comic? I did a lot of research into him. Some of it was very hard to find because when he was working secretly at the Fed, there's not much information available. But I did find out he served in the U.S. military intelligence in the 1960s. He was a computer programmer in the 1970s when there were very few. He is internationally recognized as expert on project implementation. Now, what is a bigger project than orchestrating this road to Roota theory of controlling the markets and controlling the monetary system with computer programs? That's about as big a project as you can imagine. He worked at the Boston Fed in the mid-70s through the mid-80s. Now, this is interesting. He's best friends with a legal professor, Harold J. Sullivan, who wrote Civil Rights and Liberties. The highest award for a U.S. District Attorney is the Harold J. Sullivan Award. I have yet to find anything on who that award was named for other than this guy, Harold J. Sullivan, who is knee-deep. Remember, all this stuff had to be done in secret because if they did it and the bad guys knew, then they would have been taken out. Like, they took out Kennedy and so many other people before him. So they're doing all this market rigging secretly, and that's why there's no information on who Harold J. Sullivan, the Harold J. Sullivan Award is named after. So Harold J. Sullivan, or Steven DuVal's mentor was George Goodwin Jr., who wrote this book called Little Legislatures, Committees of Congress about the Power and Autonomy of Subcommittees in Congress. Basically all about how to do things in government and keep them secret. So Steven DuVal was a consultant to the Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force. This is a guy who, supposedly only adapted this comic book. He implemented computer programs at various banks in the mid-1980s. After he was working as the Fed, market rigger with computer programs, he went over to the banks and implemented computer programs in the banking system to control everything. He's all about project implementation, and it's all about control. And then he implemented programs at IBM. A lot of people are talking about that Stuxnet virus that is supposedly implemented, and somebody has the power to shut off power plants and things like that. Well, all these power plants that are controlled by computers have software in them. And how easy would it be for someone who knew what they were doing? Obviously, Steven DuVal did. He was one of the first programmers to go into IBM and put his code into these machines that control power plants and facilities. And I mean, that's the ultimate power. If you're looking for a project implementation, you embed a secret software into every CNC device around the world. You got a lot of power there. And here's the weird thing about this guy, Steven DuVal. Like, a lot of this stuff is, why did he write this comic? If this was a secret plan, why did he give it away? Why? What is this? What was this guy thinking? He loves games. He loves secrets. His biggest kind of obsession is palindromes. Palindromes are words that spell the same thing frontwards and backwards. Race car, R-A-C-E-C-A-R. Backwards, it's R-A-C-E-C-A-R. Same. Step on no pets. You go backwards, S-T-E-P-O-N-N-O-P-E-T-S. Palindromes. This guy, Steven DuVal, was a nut for them. He even joined societies. That's how I kind of got more and more information on this guy. All right, let's talk about the obvious thing. All throughout this comic book, they talk about gold. This is the Federal Reserve Bank talking about gold and how precious it is, how amazing it is to see. From the very start of that first scene when Grandma, Arthur Burns, is talking to Alan Greenspan, now it makes more sense, right? Two staunch gold bugs talking to each other. And look at the word gold. It's underlined. It's put in italics. It's made bold. And where does she find the first flowers? Go for the golden sunlight. Gold, gold, gold. There's gold everywhere. Roota sees gold in almost every one of these scenes. And there's gold coming from all over the place. This is the Federal Reserve Bank. It's that golden light, the golden light. And it was so necessary for the system to function in Roota's world and in Arthur Burns and Greenspan's world. Just look at it all. It's ridiculous. So where does all this gold, why is gold so important? We went off the gold standard in 1971. Is it still important today? Yes, it's important today. I believe, it is my contention, that there was something that happened in the early 1900s that changed everything about the United States. And that something was this gigantic gold mine, a huge gold discovery in the middle of the Grand Canyon. Now remember, the 1900s, the Grand Canyon was almost inaccessible. You couldn't, it would take days to get there, and it was so rugged you couldn't even get there for most of the early 1800s. But let me walk you through this gigantic gold discovery and walk you through why it was so important and how it changed America. So here's an article from the New York Times, front page article on June 19th, 1912. And it says, tell of vast riches in the Grand Canyon. And some of the captions from this are, men engaged in gold dredging operations expect to astonish the world. He declares that when the whole field has been developed, the supply of gold in the world will have been increased by billions. I know that it will be difficult to comprehend that I have a correct comprehension of the wealth that is buried in the banks of the Colorado Canyon, he says, but I can demonstrate every statement I make to be absolutely true, and that my chief shortcoming is the inability to comprehend the vastness of riches that lie along that great stream. Exposed to sight are billions of yards of silt, containing more billions of dollars in wealth of precious metal than the human mind can possibly grasp in computation. I mean, that's coming from the New York Times front page in 1912. Let's just soak that in a little bit, and now let's think about what was the world like in 1900. Here's the world gold supply. Only 450 million ounces of gold had been mined prior to 1900. Here's the New York Times talking about billions of ounces of gold that have been discovered. The world's monetary gold was only about 100 million ounces. And remember, gold was money back then. The U.S. had 30 million ounces of gold in circulation and in reserve. Okay, the U.S. has 30 million ounces, and they're saying, well, we just found billions of ounces of gold. The difference between 30 million and billions of ounces. In the late 1800s, it was a very, very chaotic time with the U.S. changing from a silver standard to a gold standard. There was the gold rush, Comstock silver mother lode, crime of 73, the bimetal standard. Basically, money was very chaotic, but it was kind of contained. We used gold and silver as money. Paper money, came in, came out. It died always because they'd print too much of it. But gold and silver were kind of, as I always say, gold and silver is not the best money, the perfect money, but it's the best money we have. The introduction, and this is the big thing, the introduction of billions of ounces of gold from the Grand Canyon would have seriously devalued the monetary value of gold, creating hyperinflation and disrupting the social order around the globe. The United States, if we really did introduce all that billions of ounces of gold, what would happen to every country's, well, other than the U.S., and the people who controlled that gold in the Grand Canyon, everybody would pretty much see their monetary wealth is cut by 100 or 1,000. It would have been absolutely chaotic. And I believe that handling the consequences of the Grand Canyon gold was likely the true reason for the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Remember, that New York Times article came out in 1912. This would have been a huge deal. All the economists and central bankers would have gotten together and said, oh my God, this is just going to throw the world into chaos. 1 year later, secretly pushed through is the Federal Reserve System. President Woodrow Wilson, the president that signed the Federal Reserve Act, regretted allowing the Federal Reserve Act to be passed. Here are two important quotes that I think you should keep in mind when we're discussing this stuff. This is from Woodrow Wilson. I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Does that sound like a president who was happy he signed the Federal Reserve Act? But can you also see how it was forced upon him by all these economists and bankers saying, hey, if we release this gold to the world, it would crush everything, and you're talking about pure chaos. And here's the other quote, and this one's from me. The decision to hide the Grand Canyon gold was the biggest mistake in the history of the United States, and we are still living with the consequences today. So let's talk about what happened to the Grand Canyon gold. I mean, if you've got billions of ounces sitting there in the Grand Canyon, what happened to it all? Well, the first thing I want to say about this is that the New York Times article from 1912 talked about a whole bunch of mining equipment going in there, and they had already started mining. And this deposit was actually found in the earlier 1900s, like 1903, 1904, along with all the Egyptian artifacts and things like that they were pulling out of the Grand Canyon. But it took years to get any kind of equipment to that remote part of the Grand Canyon. So keep that in mind as we talk about what happened to it. First, we have Roosevelt, who was the president in the right before Wilson. He created the Grand Canyon Game Preserve by proclamation in 1906, and then the Grand Canyon National Monument in 1908. Further Senate bills to establish the site as a national park were introduced and defeated in 1910 and 1911. I don't know if Congress was told what was going on there, but they clearly weren't on board with locking this place up. And before the Grand Canyon National Park Act, which finally was signed by Woodrow Wilson in 1919 before he left office, that's the thing that really locked up the Grand Canyon and put it under the surveillance and government's control. Even today, large portions of the Grand Canyon are strictly off limits to any civilian exploration, and they are protected by the U.S. Marines. I'll have more on that in a second. Presidents Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama have all tried to secure mining rights within the Grand Canyon and have all been turned away by congressional committees. Obama has even signed executive orders trying to get the Bureau of Land Management millions of acres of secret gold deposits and silver deposits under his control, but they're not allowed to do it. Nobody's allowed to go there. Now, here's a really interesting part. Insiders have said that while attempting to extract the gold from the Grand Canyon, this is the early days, probably the 20s, a huge rock slide buried the largest seam of gold under millions of tons of rock, as seen in the Wishes and Rainbows comic when they had that rock slide. Remember I pointed that out? And a decision was made to save the gold for future generations. Now, here's something really interesting. There was a movie called McKenna's Gold in the 70s. Almost the exact same thing happened. They were looking for hidden gold in the Grand Canyon, and they find this gigantic gold seam, and there's a huge rock slide that buries everything. Supposedly that was a kind of a reenactment of what actually happened when they were trying to mine this gold in the Grand Canyon in the early 1920s. Because if you think about the Grand Canyon and the cliffs, if you set off explosives or try to dig gold out of the side of the cliff, it's very easy. You can see how those cliffs could fall down, and apparently that's what did happen. President Theodore Roosevelt said, "The Grand Canyon fills me with awe. It's beyond comparison, beyond description, absolutely unparalleled throughout the wide world. Let this great wonder of nature remain as it is now. Do nothing to mar its grandeur, sublimity, and loveliness. You cannot improve on it. But what you can do is keep it for your children, your children's children, and all who come after you as the one great sight which every American should see." I mean, that sums it up right there. Keep that money for your future, because people accept these pieces of fiat paper, and one day they won't. So what are you going to do? All you have to do is go in there, mine the gold, and you're golden, shall we say. Now, here's something really interesting. I interviewed a very reliable source who was detained by U.S. Marines in a remote part of the Little Colorado River in the 1960s. He and his father were taken to a military base within the Grand Canyon and released after questioning. He did see some of the Egyptian artifacts. He said he didn't see any gold, but it was a huge base. It was a huge base right in the middle of the Grand Canyon, and you have no idea it's there. But him and his father were going down, and all of a sudden, these guys on the side of the banks, military with guns drawn, said, "Get over here," and he apparently went in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, his father was with the military, very high up in the military, so they got questioned and were allowed to leave. But it just corroborates all this other stuff of why people can't go in the Grand Canyon, in certain parts of the Grand Canyon, and there's a lot more to this story that the people have a right to know about. There are also many more hidden gold mines in the United States. The whole idea of the plan for the United States was to use the fiat money to buy everybody else's natural resources first, keep all our stuff in the ground, keep our oil in the ground, keep our gold and silver and commodities in the ground, use everybody else's first, because they're accepting these electronic blips we call money these days, and then when that system falls apart, you can pull your own stuff out of the ground. And here's a great example of that. There's gold hidden at the Chocolate Mountain Military Base in California. And this is from an article called The Great Gold Heist by Karen Lee Bixman. Now, Bixman, it's got no relation at all. It's the first time I've seen it. That kind of cracked me up. It kind of called to me, so I read the article, and she's right on. This is exactly what's happening. In 1994, California Senator Dianne Feinstein, who leads the military intelligence committees, orchestrated a very controversial takeover of one of the largest gold deposits in the world in the Chocolate Mountains of California. This is down Southern California near Nevada. Donald Fife, a spokesman for the National Association of Mining Districts, said of the heist, the 103rd Congress managed to accommodate more than a gang of train robbers could achieve in a lifetime when they approved the Desert Wilderness Protection Act. Fife was commenting on recent information that indicates tens of billions of dollars in gold deposits. The Mesquite Gold Mine is one of the top 10 mines in the United States and has some of the most profitable gold deposits of any mine in the world. To the north is the Chocolate Mountain Gunnery Range. The Mesquite open pit gold mine literally stops at the fence that borders the gunnery range. Unbeknownst to the public, inside the range is the world's richest gold rift zone. Geologists estimate that the gold contained in this zone is worth between $40 and $100 billion. This is the 1990s. So gold was, $300. So you can figure out how many ounces that is. These are surface gold deposits which are more profitable to mine than the 1 mile deep deposits in South Africa. Engineers allege that in 1981 and 1982, Consolidated Goldfields, which owned the mine at the time, illegally drilled into the gunnery range area to determine the composition of the ore body. The samples proved to be of high quality. According to these same engineers, beginning in the mid-1980s, military helicopters brought high-ranking military officers, congressmen, and senators to the area to examine these large gold deposits. Why else would you bring all these people, these high-ranking military people, to a mine unless there is something extremely special going on? Now, the Desert Wilderness Protection Act has been expanded to millions and millions of acres now, and I believe that there's massive amounts of gold in California, massive amounts all over the United States that our government is hiding from us until that day comes, and then all of a sudden, we can go back to, we can leave the insanity of this unbacked fiat system, and we'll have the gold there to move on to a gold standard. Another thing I find very interesting is all the kind of the secrets about gold in caves and mountains. And then you have the comic book, all they do in that is they talk about caves of gold, and that's where Roota and Rocky are looking for gold. Very interesting. Now let's move on to the black tears in the petrodollar. Clearly, one of the most bizarre parts of this of this comic book was the shedding of the black tears from the flowers. Just very bizarre, and how the black tears need the ray of golden sunlight to grow into new flowers. So the Fed is telling us this book is filled with metaphors. Now, when you look at the gold in relation to how it affects the black tears and it grows into these beautiful flowers, and if we think about the black tears being the petrodollar, we need to understand what's going on with the petrodollar and how that worked in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. So what is the petrodollar? You know, people say it all the time. They never give you a good explanation of it. They said, oh, it's just money gained from selling of oil. It's not really what the petrodollar is. So the petrodollar, after the U.S. went off the gold standard in 1971, the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, arranged a secret agreement with Saudi Arabia to only accept U.S. dollars for their oil sales in exchange for military protection. This is what's really going on, what the real petrodollar is. By 1975, all the members of OPEC had agreed to similar deals as Saudi Arabia, which created an even greater demand for U.S. dollars around the world. The agreements to trade oil in U.S. dollars not only created an artificial demand for the dollar, as any country wanting to import oil must first convert their national currencies into U.S. dollars, and required all countries to hold U.S. dollars in reserve for future oil purchases. As an added benefit to the U.S. financial system, the U.S. also required Saudi Arabia to deposit the money they make from oil back into U.S. banks and invest heavily in U.S.-based assets such as the U.S. debt securities, U.S. equities, in order to additionally support their values. So it was kind of a recycling of the petrodollar. The world would pay for oil in dollars. The Saudis and others would reinvest in the U.S. to prop up all the assets and the U.S. debt, and it just went round and round. When oil-producing countries wanted to sell oil for other currencies, the U.S. would threaten to use military action on them in attempts to stop this from happening. That was the case in Iraq and in Syria, Venezuela, and North Korea. That was the whole idea. If you decide unilaterally on your own to sell oil in anything other than U.S. dollars, we're not going to let it happen, and we're going to attack you. We'll figure out a reason why to attack you. Although the petrodollar has helped the U.S. dollar and financial system immensely over the past 45 years, it's now breaking down and being used as a weapon against the U.S. strongholds in the world. Saudi Arabia is now threatening to sell all U.S. assets, which many believe would destroy the value of the U.S. dollar. Personally, I don't think Saudi Arabia selling their $700 billion in U.S. assets will have a blink of difference, considering that the U.S. dollar is now, the price of the U.S. dollar is now determined on the derivative market, where 5 trillion U.S. dollar derivatives are traded every day, so 700 billion is not going to do much at all. All right, so what was Roota's big plan? In the comic book, Roota's plan is to return colored flowers to Pebbleton, which can also be understood as returning the United States to a gold standard. When tasked with this by the mayor, which was President Ford at the time, Roota writes economic formulas in the sand. Now, remember, Alan Greenspan in the 70s was placed as the head of the economic advisors for President Ford. He basically had two tasks. One is to figure out how to stay off a gold standard and without the monetary system collapsing. And number two was to take care of Social Security system, which was a gigantic problem back then, just like it's a gigantic problem now, and Greenspan is actually talking about that almost daily now. But it was part of the Road to Roota theory, is that if you look how Roota allocates assets, she decides to give the oldest people the first flowers. Interesting, considering that Greenspan was tasked to fix the Social Security problem. If we do have a monetary collapse, you can bet that Alan Greenspan is going to start with the Social Security system and say, well, we've got so many people of older age that have been working so long, they should get the first new money allocated by the Fed if that is something that is accepted by the people, which even the teacher's guide says it might not be accepted. In the 1981 version, it was an asset allocation model, very similar to On the Road to the Golden Age, which concluded that in order to return to a gold standard, a country should first increase the unbacked fiat money system to infinity, soaking up all the benefits, free money, before returning to the discipline of a gold standard. So there's Roota. This is from the 1981 comic, and notice what she's writing in the sand. She's writing these asset allocation models. That's exactly what Alan Greenspan was doing in the early 70s when asked to fix the Social Security system. But the formula she's writing in the ground, it took a while to decipher. I had to do some close-ups, and I'll show you in a second. But I finally determined that it was a formula from the 1960s called On the Road to the Golden Age. And this formula basically said, in order to return to a gold standard, when you're off a gold standard, the best way to do that is to run the unbacked system as long as hard as you can, printing money to infinity, and then collapsing the system. So the way it looks is you'll see in the sand that Roota writes the G and P is to be invested, and you can see the G and P, the T equals infinity with the squiggly line under it. And that's exactly kind of the conclusion of On the Road to the Golden Age series. The part of GNP to be invested is assumed to be a certain to be determined function of time. The production function is taken to be Cobb-Douglas with constant returns to scale. The optimal growth path is determined under the various assumptions about labor supply. It is shown that the Golden Age results are obtained as time approaches infinity. So they want to run this as long as possible, and that was the conclusion back in the 1970s, and that's kind of the where it shows the conclusion mathematically. It's very complicated in my world, these economic formulas, but in Greenspan world, this is the stuff he loves. This is the stuff that was leading edge when he was under the tutelage of Arthur Burns, and learning how to be an economist and learning how to control the system with his computer programs. So that was the 1981 version. That was their conclusion. Hey, let's run the system as long as we can. So, what's really going on with the debt of the United States? How many times have we heard Congress say, we need to get the budgets and debt under control? I mean, every congressman, anybody running for office, they all say the same thing, but do they ever do it? That's the big question. In 1981, 1982, the Gold Commission, Reagan put together a Gold Commission when inflation was going through the roof and Paul Volcker jacked interest rates up to 20%. Reagan put together a Gold Commission to decide whether or not to go on a gold standard. The conclusion of that report read this way. The majority of us at this time favor essentially no change in the present role of gold. Yet we are not prepared to rule out that an enlarged role for gold may emerge at some future date. Here's the key part. If reasonable price stability and confidence in our currency are not restored in the years ahead, we believe that those who advocate an immediate return to gold will grow in numbers and political influence. And then there was a minority report secretly snuck in when the Gold Commission report was submitted to Reagan. And in this report, from the book by Anna Schwartz, the existence of a minority report was not revealed to the Gold Commission until a few days before the final revision of the report that was intended to represent all views. The minority report was prepared under the direction of Congressman Ron Paul and mirrors his views rather than those of Louis Lehrman, who endorsed it. Ron Paul, proposed a delay in the implementation of the program outlined therein until the Reagan administration's fiscal and monetary programs and the recommendations of the Gold Commission were given an opportunity to prove themselves. So basically, let's delay until you guys destroy the system. And then Alan Greenspan himself in 1981 There is a growing, this is from a Time Magazine article, there is a growing disillusionment with monetary theory, monetary policy, monetary instruments generally, and people are looking around to see what the alternatives might be. One is gold. Now, this is right before, he didn't get into the Fed until 1987. So they're saying all this in 1981. Wait, we'll give the Reagan administration time to get their affairs in order, get the debt under control, get the budgets under control, right? So what happened? That's exactly what happened. Since 1980, the debt was blown to kingdom come, and there has never, through Star Wars and real wars and social programs, we have spent more money than anybody in the history of the world, all starting right there in 1980, 1981, when they turned in that Gold Commission report that said, hey, we'll go back to gold when we have to, but first we're going to print money like it's going out of style, and that's exactly what we've done. So let's go through a summary of Greenspan's big plan to implement this gold-backed currency and ultimately get us back to a monetary system backed by gold. And his plan, it was rig all the markets via computer programs to control the price of all monetary instruments and commodities in order to facilitate the world's first unbacked global monetary system. That's exactly what we have. And it's all done with computers and derivatives. I've been saying it for years. Computers and derivatives run the price of everything. It doesn't matter how much physical silver is bought, sold, or dug up out of the ground. It's all down to the derivatives. And that goes for every other commodity, every stock, every bond. It's all about derivatives. Run the unbacked system to its maximum capacity, creating unbacked fiat money at will while talking up the need for balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility. Yeah, who does that sound like? Everybody in Congress. Grow the U.S. debt and unfunded liabilities to unimaginable amounts. Soak up all the benefits of unbacked fiat money by building houses and infrastructure, building the military, and funding social programs that the U.S. cannot afford. Remove all regulation around derivatives in order to give the banks enough rope to hang themselves. It's exactly what Greenspan did at the end of the 90s. Removed all derivatives to create bigger and bigger bubbles so that when they burst, there's no choice but to go back onto a gold standard. We're required to testify in public, be as obtuse and incomprehensible as possible in order to steer people away from what was really happening. That sums Greenspan up right there. You couldn't understand a word he was saying. And all he was doing was keeping the people away from what was secretly going on in the background. At some point, orchestrate a computer program generated global market crash and destroy the unbacked global monetary system. He has tried and tried again. He tried in 1987, 2 months after he got in office. There's a computer. All these crashes are controlled by computers. Greenspan wrote the first computer programs. He invented the electronic asset in 87, in 2000, 2008, and then I believe he's going to do it again in 2016, which is this year. And then ultimately advocate a return to the discipline of a gold standard. And then after you crash the system, allocate the new money to the U.S. population according to Social Security balances, just like Roota did, giving the older people the first flowers because they'd already put in the work. Okay, here's where it gets a little dicey, and we're nearing the end of this presentation, but it's probably the most important part. The Fed's fear of the big people. This one slide should be disturbing to everybody because everybody thinks the Fed is the big people. The Fed are the nasty ones who, control the system. But there's something else going on, and the Federal Reserve is, at least the people working behind the scenes, are very afraid of these big people, as they call them. And remember, this is kind of right after Kennedy was taken out, and there's a lot more going on there than what they told us. So the Fed's afraid of someone, and they're going to show us in this new comic exactly what is going on, because there's only one significant change in the 2007 version of Wishes and Rainbows compared to the 1981 version. Here's Roota writing in the sand her asset allocation model, right? It's the on the road to the golden age model that you print the money to infinity. Everything else in the comic is exactly the same except this. Can you see what Roota's writing? 11 plus 9, or 9/11, and then the Islamic crescent moon in the flower. Does that send chills through your spine? This is what I think is going on currently. It's my contention that due to the terror attacks of 9/11, the good guys within the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury have decided to put an end to the ongoing computer price manipulation required to support the current unbacked fiat monetary system. Upon ending the market control mechanism, the current system will be destroyed quickly by the implosion of the derivative complex and the subsequent collapse of the fractional reserve banking system. After the crash, the big people that have abused the system will be removed and their control over our lives will finally end. This one-time creative destruction event will wipe the slate clean in order for us to build a new and honest monetary system based on sound money, free markets, and honest dealings. That's the end of part one. I encourage you to spread this information around. It's all there. It's all laid out before you. That all the evidence is there, and it's kind of hard to argue against it. Come to roadtoroota.com, sign up and get free emails. I put out 3 or 4 emails every week, and it follows up on what's going on behind the scenes the best I can figure it out. And there's a lot more to talk about. I'll be doing more of these. But right now, is this the end? Well, stay tuned for the next video, which will cover more secrets as the truth is revealed along the road to Roota.